Okay, guys, so today for our second podcast, we will cover some tips for moving from amateur to professional. So, in this context, you're competing typically with 24s and you're trying to move to 32s for males, or in women, typically competing with, say, 16s and moving to 20s or 24s, depending on the organization. Okay, so I'll briefly cover some programming ideas and a bit of a framework there, some ideas on strength, a little bit on flexibility, but I've had another question about that, so I'll cover that in a bit more in detail in another podcast. Endurance and technique, which I think is obviously very important. So I won't necessarily cover that in that order, but we'll start with programming. So probably the first thing you can do, which is the easiest, is at the end of your warm-up, before you start your main set, you could probably add in a single set or maybe a couple of sets to feel like the heavier weight. That's really good for developing specific strength, and you don't need a large volume to develop your specific strength. So um, over time, hopefully you can start to increase the volume. And maybe you could start to have a bit of a heavy day where you use a bell above your comp weight or your desired comp weight. And to get there, you probably need to start with low volume on that day. And you you want to build volume, I should say, and you want to start with lower density, probably lower RPM as well, which you can play around with later on. But probably the easiest way to start to build volume is to do a few reps with that every minute on the minute or 1 minute turnaround, depending on what sort of terminology you like. Then you could say progress to 60-second intervals, 2-minute intervals, 3-minute intervals. And that's that sort of short to long approach that they use for speed training in athletics. So using those sort of approaches can be really useful. From a strength standpoint, I typically recommend more traditional strength training because that's going to be better at getting your tendons to adapt. And it can change things in the muscle a little bit more. So just to clarify, typically with tendons, they respond better to fast sort of plyometric-y type stuff or heavy load, typically above 80% of what your 1 rep max. So by developing or by doing some strength training, you'll hopefully increase your tendons' ability to contribute and help with kettlebell sport, because obviously we want to use our tendons and those passive structures. With muscles, muscle fiber type is somewhat plastic, and if you're able to, so it can change, I should say, if you're able to recruit those bigger muscle fibers, then they will actually become sort of more metabolically tolerant. So if you have those type 2B or X fibers, if you stimulate them, they'll typically become type 2A fibers. And study that looked at weightlifters found that they actually had very little type 2X fibers because they would recruit them all the time and they become sort of more aerobically tolerant. So they were type 2A, which is quite interesting, I think. Also, getting stronger develops your local muscular endurance or your strength endurance. So, you can sort of develop that with higher rep stuff, but we're already doing that with kettlebell sport. So my preference for most people, not always, but is to work on max strength. So if you're really strong already, you might not need to do this sort of general strength, but for most people, working on heavier, sort of somewhat specific exercises will be really helpful. So if you improve your max strength, you'll improve your 50% 1 rep max to failure, things like that. Or an absolute load. So if you improve your max strength, your 40 kilo squat to failure or bench to failure or whatever will be improved by a similar amount to if you're doing higher rep stuff and you get the added benefit of improving strength. Now, if you were to sort of attack that with, like I mentioned before, those sort of specific strength training sets, You can just sort of add 2 kilos initially, then 4 kilos, maybe up to 10 or 12 kilos, depending on how you're feeling and what exercise. This is also where you can start to use different lifts, such as one arm jerk and spending time in fixation. That can actually be really useful for snatch. You can get a heavier weight up overhead and just spend time developing sort of that fixation position. That can, of course, carry over to jerk, things like that. We can do pause jerks to make certain positions more challenging. And it's worthwhile thinking about the fact that as you get heavier, it sort of amplifies things. So the positions, you might find you're trying to dip. You might need to dip more when you're doing, double jerks with 8 kilos more load. So it sort of changes the exercise. You might have to get under it a bit more, things like that. So over time, though, we want to start to revert back to that becoming more your normal technique, and hopefully you get stronger so you can apply force in a quicker way, and you can get sort of back to that sort of more efficient technique. And balance is a particular thing as well. Now, I just want to bring up some of my own ideas, which is as you get stronger, say particularly in the snatch, when you're dropping the bell, initially, if your fingers slip or how you receive the bell in the hand insertion, initially you might have a bit of an eccentric component, which is going to cause muscle damage, which can reduce your efficiency. But as you get stronger, you might find your muscles can work isometrically, and that means the force is getting transferred into the tendons a bit more. So if the muscle, at least the active components, stay at a similar length, um, that's what I mean when I say isometric in this context, which is more likely quasi-isometric, because the joints are changing and things like that. But the force will get transferred into the tendon, and you're using that passive structure, which hopefully will help prolong performance. I hope that makes sense. But again, when I'm talking about technique, so when you're particularly with cleans, if you're doing double cleans, you've been predominantly doing 24s, maybe a bit of 28s. Now you're trying some 32 cleans. It's going to try and pull you around a lot more. So you're going to have to counterbalance more. And likewise with the snatch, it's going to pull you around. So you need to probably counterbalance to a greater extent. So you're having to play around with how much you're moving your body. And over time, you'll get stronger and you can kind of resist it a bit more. But that's just something to consider. And this is also where, say, cleans might help develop strength for snatches, things like that. So again, with the intention, coming back to your general training, as always, I should say you shouldn't need to rush to just committing to only doing pros, which obviously a lot of the world championships do lock you in once you are competing as a pro. But in other competitions, in national competitions, I believe most people can switch between 24s or 16s, and all that stuff can be really useful for developing strength, endurance, or just endurance in general, I should have said. So that's just another point to consider, going off on a bit of a tangent here. But as always with our intention, once you initially start using these heavier bells, it might feel like a max effort. And over time, we want to sort of just apply our force quickly, typically, in the acceleration pull or the bump phase in the jerk. And then we're, sort of trying to apply our force quickly and then relax as much as possible. And that's sort of where flexibility can be really useful, helping with moving between these different positions and things like that. Typically, when I use 32s, I spend a lot more time in the red zone, and you sort of just need to build up a bit of a tolerance for that. So that's something to consider. So I think adding in sprint interval training, just max effort on a bike or a rower, 30 seconds or less, can be really useful. Also, some high intensity interval training, which is sort of typically at a bit of a lower intensity, maybe sort of your 5-minute time trial kind of pace. You might go a little bit above that or a bit below that, but if you're going more than 120%, you're sort of veering into that sprint interval training. But trying to accumulate 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes of volume in that red zone during a session when you're using the heavier bells is probably a great option. So that's another thing to consider. And I've talked about flexibility before, but basically, just to summarize, take your time getting into the heavier bells. Typically, I'd recommend just starting with low volume, just so you can feel like the technique and develop specific strength. While you're doing that, you might like to add in some more higher intensity endurance training and higher intensity resistance training. Both of those can be lower volume, but the idea is you're building up your body's general ability to tolerate stuff. And if you're not very flexible and you can't rest, of course, you've got to target that flexibility as well, because you've got to get everything sort of working together there. And again, so once you're more familiar with the bells, then you can start to do like full sessions with them. Again, you can sort of slowly build up the volume and go from there. So I hope that's helpful. I tried to keep this at 10 minutes, but I'm about 12 minutes. So I'll keep working on getting it to 10 minutes. Thanks, guys. Hope you enjoyed it.